edition of Navigating the Planetary, the book I edited together with Kimberly Bradley. We are going to present to you 5 of the authors this afternoon. Stephanie Bailey, who will join us from London on Zoom, Sanjukta Sunderason and Kate Sutton, who are on the first panel, which I'm going to moderate, and Rosalyn and Olamiju, Fajemisin, who will be the second panel. And in the very end, there will be a big discussion with everybody and also with you and people in Zoom. And in the audience, I will very warmly welcome Christian Hofellner, who is the graphic designer of the book and and we feel very privileged to have been working with him because it's really now become a wonderful book and also very light, which was important for us. And Agape Graham, she's from our editor or our publisher, Verlag für Moderne Kunst in Vienna. Kimberly and I will give a short introduction, then it will be the 2 panels, and as I said, and all in all, it will last until 8 perhaps. And as we are not so many, we think we can make a break after the first panel, and you will be very, how do you say this, distanced and wearing the mask and so on. This volume was created as a guidebook and also, as the subtitle says, a guide to navigating the planetary art world, its past, present, and potential. For us, it was very important that it is a book where people working in the planetary art field can find their way through it or through certain articles, but also people who feel to be new in this art world. And I always remembered my situation in the 1990s when I wanted to kind of start navigating the planetary art world, and it was so incredibly difficult coming from a very Western background and very Western art history. I just didn't know where to start with. And this is also why we have this big apparatus in the back, where most of the authors gave us a reading list, which they would recommend, where we have a glossary, which is also done by most of the authors, and also an index. Through essays and case studies and interviews situated in the past, present, and looking into the future, this book explores people, institutions, and thoughts that are dissolving East-West and global North-South binaries or rendering them irrelevant. So that means we have 4 sections. It is one section with 2 introductory essays. One is written by Stephanie Bailey. She will tell you this afternoon a little bit about her approach and also what she did in the meanwhile. Then there is past, present, and future, which was also very important for us to look into the future. And as you all know, the future when we worked on this book seemed to be another future than it is now. And we have 3 different types of writings. One are essays, then we have case studies, something like best practice of artworks and also institutions. They are only situated in the past and the present. We did not figure out any idea how to go into the future with the case study. And then there are interviews. How have artists, creators, and institutions addressed transcultural issues, and how could they in the future? Which methods do such individuals use to root themselves in various regions of the world and make themselves understood to others? This is the core questions we pose. How did we start this project? It started in a way in 2011 when when we did a big symposium in Salzburg, which was called Global Art, and was a symposium on does something like global art exist, and how to write global art history. And then officially we established the project, which we did now for 6 years, called Global Academy around 2015. And the first, the second conference was then in 2016 called Global Academy. And it was about alternative academies teaching and learning art in the so-called Global South. And in 2018, Kimberly Bradley and myself did the symposium, which was called something with transcultural exchange, examples of I think Global Academy 2 examples of transcultural exchange. And from working together for so long, because Kimberly also taught 3 years art writing, we developed this idea of the book. And as my term at the Summer Academy is ending this month, so this is this and tomorrow the open day, my last official appearances as director of the Summer Academy, and I'm very, very happy that it is this book. Yeah, now I introduce you briefly perhaps. So this is Kimberly Bradley. She's an art critic and journalist working for New York Times and many art magazines. She's a teacher for New York University in Berlin. And what else? Maybe other things?
I edit a lot.
You edit other books also. Yeah, so it's your turn now. We always have to switch because of the Zoom.
Are people watching us? They must be. I'm going to explain just a little bit more about how the book unfolded, a little bit about process. Hildegund mentioned how the ideas came to pass through your many years of dealing with the topics. But when we really sat down, we had many meetings at Café Englander in Vienna, many, they know us there, about what this book could be. The very first ideas were how we could take some of the conferences a little bit further and who might write for us. About half of the authors in this volume have somehow been involved with your Global Academy project, either as part of the symposia or as individual speakers in the off years. You kept inviting them in to give lectures individually. Some of them had developed their ideas further or wanted to write about something slightly different. Other writers were people that we knew through your many years of activity as a curator, as a professor, as director of the Summer Academy, and your many travels. And some of my people were a little bit more on the journalistic end, and we found someone like Rosalyn by looking at the internet at your writing. Some of them were just people we really wanted to work with. The structure Hildegund described that we divided the book into past, present, future. We by no means consider these explorations complete. You can see that there are huge gaps in the discussions. We did what we could. There's a little bit of focus here and there on an Austrian point of view. We have a really wonderful essay by Simone Miller about transculturality in this very academy in the past. It was the only way we could really figure out how to cover the scope of what we were doing temporally. The typologies also allowed us to make this book a true guidebook. We didn't want only academic essays. We also didn't want a book of only interviews, which you see quite a lot in the art world, just big fat interview books that feel like they're banged out a little bit. And we had certain institutions that we wanted to dig in further. Why, for example, was Raw Material Company in Senegal so interesting? So we created this typology of writing a case study. And those texts are slightly more journalistic than some of the others. What I found as I we both edited things. We had a couple of things come in German and were translated. We both edited together, but I ended up doing a lot of the deep digging into English, and I noticed these little threads emerging that weren't necessarily assigned. There was a bit of an emotional aspect to some of the texts, the discussions of collaboration, of care, which is coming up elsewhere in the art world. It wasn't really necessarily something we were thinking of when we were originally commissioning the text. I need to put my glasses down, I have some more. Of course, decolonization of the global south were huge. Othering, we knew that those things would come up, but also the idea of definition and the use of language, and even having the discussions that we're having. How can a global or planetary art world discuss things when each discussant may have a different definition of the terminology we're using? English is sadly the lingua franca of the art world. Sadly or not sadly, it is my native tongue, but we have to always take into consideration things get funneled through this particular linguistic filter. I wrote something in the introduction that this book became an epistemological but also emotional constellation. By no means complete, but in the end I'm really kind of surprised to have the book in my hands and see how much is in there. I was afraid to look at it at first because we spent so much time editing it. One other thing I'd like to mention is that a lot of discussion of power structures come up in the book. Criticism of how the Western world has functioned and kind of a yearning for broadening our points of view. And we were very well aware that we are part of that Eurocentric structure. That the book was Austria-funded, which is lovely. It offers a certain platform, but also we replicate the power structure in how it was done. I just want to mention this. One more thing, and before I give it back to Hildegund, we had a moment of panic when the lockdowns began. We were not finished editing the book. We thought, should we ask all the authors for a postscript? Should we commission another text really quickly? Are we completely doing the wrong thing by publishing this? Of course, that thought didn't last very long and we went on with it. What we do wonder is if this book will remain a guidebook, or as we also see in the introduction, be a bit of a snapshot of a slightly more irresponsible time in human history. Anyway, I'm going to give it back to Hildegund. She's going to discuss how to use the book. There is a bit of a methodology in that. Is it me?
Yeah, still.
I can do that. Okay. Christian had many wonderful ideas in how to design his book. He was in lots of the meetings at Cafe England too. We have the table of contents on both the inside. Is that one? No, it's just this one that folds out. Sorry, I wasn't quite prepared for this. We have glossary terminology. As Hildegund meant, we crowdsourced a glossary. The words, the terms in the glossary are highlighted or kind of reverse highlighted in gray throughout the book the first time they appear in each article. We have, what am I missing? The index is a pretty standard index, but it's quite comprehensive because of the volume of different approaches that we have. And the reading list. Each author gave us actually really wonderful reading lists. This is a wonderful resource. And I found as I edited this that I bought a lot of books on Amazon during lockdown that I didn't already have. I think that is it. We are now going to Zoom to Stephanie Bailey.
All right, so shall I begin?
Yes.
Okay, let's see how this goes. And if the sound cuts off, then someone just give me a signal. All right, so I'll say again, thank you so much, Hildegund and Kimberly, for having me. It's really great to be part of this and speaking into the space. So I'm just going to give a very, I'll try to make a brief introduction to the essay, and I will be quoting part of the text within this introduction. that essay. For the final Ross platform, now where the subtitle for the text, Navigating Without a Compass, introduced the text publication, which explored historical dynamics and described into geopolitical terms and the interest of what meant to view. To label a territory without the permission of those who inhabit it is not only a violence, it provokes violence too, especially at a time when, and we're seeing those effects at a time when uprisings and protests across the world are signaling at once ruptures brought about by history that are unresolved in the present, but also a need to imagine new frameworks of being together globally, taking into account what Kwame Appiah has said about there being, quote, 7 billion fellow humans living on a small warming planet today, which means the cosmopolitan impulse that draws on our common humanity is no longer a luxury but a necessity. So this idea of finding ways to facilitate a common togetherness is the foundation upon which I responded to Hildegund and Kimberly's invitation to consider how to approach the definition of the planetary today. As a starting point, I acted the text of Charles Eames's Powers of Ten, a short film that starts with a bird's eye view of a couple picnicking on a lakefront before zooming out into deep space and returning to the molecular composition of the body. And we end, as the narration states, with a single proton filling our scene, and we reach the edge of present understanding. So in the text, I describe Powers of Ten as a visual depiction of the planetary perspective, a total view of the world bound by vast and intricate spatial relation, or to quote scholar Derek Wood, the representation of, quote, all known scales of the universe in one continuous view. So Powers of Ten is a starting point for consideration of what the word planetary not only describes but encapsulates, that is planet Earth and everything that is contained within its known bounds, while bearing in mind that planetary, quote unquote, is first and foremost the word that at a very basic level describes the world, that is the planet, the Earth, or if you like, the globe that we live on. So moving from Powers of Ten, we arrive at the model, the first photograph of the whole Earth taken by human being captured in 1972 from Apollo 17. Iconic for inspired chemist Gregory Pesco because it perfectly represents the human condition of living on an island in the universe. So this description aligns with the common feeling that astronauts described after Earth gazing from space, an acute awareness of Earth's interconnectedness as a living whole, which Frank White called as a phenomenon the overview effect. And that first-hand experience, it can be argued, was mirrored by those who witnessed the images too, like a collective mirror stage in which people were able to view the world as a singular object from afar. So a precursor to the model was the first color image of the Earth taken by humans, a shot of the half-illuminated planet peering out from beyond the surface of the moon, known as Earthrise, taken in 1967-1968 from Apollo 8. And in her essay, Seeing Global, Stephen Buckmore's cites and Blumenberg's description of Earthrise as the initiation of the rapid and almost silent transformation in human consciousness, which occurred more through the cosmic reflection created in the stream of transmitted images of Earth than, for example, the first moonwalk in setup. And of course, Blue Marble is said to be one of the most reproduced images in existence. So these images heralded what historians and innovative term the Earthrise era, in which a global vocabulary, from the use of the term globalization to phrases like global economy, emerged. But, writes in Untitled, while Earth's image would become the most prominent symbol of the contemporary age, it eventually became, quote, culturally reinscribed as a representation of corporate global prowess and or ecological concern, unquote. And this reinscription aligns with the dominant term that defines this new era, namely globalization, which Christian Raru, critics summed up as totalization, a byword or ideology for a complete and completed perfect world characterized by smooth and frictionless flows of capital, information, and language. So it's in this response to this technological totalization that Spivak proposed the planetary as a counterpoint to globalization's, quote, imposition of the same system of exchange everywhere, unquote. brought about an unprecedented alignment between what they call an ascended Asia, a revitalized America, and a reintegrated Greater Europe, including a recovered Russia, creating an economic juggernaut that falls along most other regions of the planet. And for Schwartz and Maiden, fundamental technological change and a new ethos of openness in this new plausible Samaritan of new world would bring about the beginnings of a global civilization. And of course, from the vantage point of 2020, the scenario has not aged well. For one, it can be argued that it's China, not America, that has led the developments in 5G wireless technology in a competition like the Cold War space race. And it's China, too, that claimed the world as one as part of its tagline for the 2008 Olympics. A reality that underscores the bias not only in Schwartz and Maiden's article, but in the concept of a unified global planet communicated through NASA's Apollo-era imagery in the 60s and early 70s, created during the space race, a battle that unfolded as part of the Cold War. In this frame, the images of the Earth transmitted during this period were not only, to quote Susan Buck-Moore, as a triumph of modernity and the technological dream of human progress, the apogee of American power. These images were also victories of war. They were not just world images that flagged in the ground, and the myth upon which the planet was claimed. In much the same way that China just had, in the Olympic Games, they just had one world, one year. So it's from this premise that I resisted the definitions of the word planetary. Not by rejecting them, but by remaining open to the different predictions that are staked on it, along with other work by association concepts that are commonly used to describe the world as a whole state. So from this perspective, I consider the world at its most basic level of the commons, in line with Rancière's definition of the common, which Hart interprets, quote, not as the realm of sameness or difference, but as the scene of encounter of social and political differences at times characterized by agreement and at others antagonism, at times composing political bodies and at others decomposing them, unquote. While there are many words to describe the world, and indeed many terms and lenses through which people conceptualize it, we really do only have this one planet between us all, the ultimate commons, as a site of constant negotiation. To consider the world as the commons in this way is to understand the importance of facilitating conversation and communication among differences, rather than to assert singular brains, or definitions over a space that is ultimately shared, which can never truly be claimed by a single power or narrative, except perhaps for the reality that we all live and die here. If the world is to be redefined then, we need spaces to facilitate that redefinition or renegotiation in such a way that resists the competitive tendencies that are all too often described in the actual definition itself. So in this regard, and in writing the essay, I found the specific concept of which describes a process of inclusive, participatory, and transparent dialogue that builds empathy and seeks out wise decisions for the collective good to be incredibly helpful. And this is a concept that was introduced to me by artist Anjali Lal in the context of 52 Artists, 52 Actions, a project that was organized by Artspace Sydney that engaged 52 artists and collectors throughout Asia to explore the region by effectively mapping it with artistic projects that reflect embodied experiences of globalization that inevitably link and unlink with those beyond the region itself. Which brings me to the subtitle of my essay for this book, Dismantle the Map, that is to take apart and impose structures language that contains multitudes of interpretations, a position that takes into account the fact that in art we need not, as creative practitioners, to align ourselves too rigidly with the tendencies of the Academy to stake claim to what work means, and how we or others can use it. We can also create spaces to explore the richness of the words we use too, and the nuances that we give to them. So that's a little tour through the text.
I may ask a quick question. Stephanie, did your research shift a little bit after the lockdowns began? You were finished with this text, but I know that you continued a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to start is actually, when you guys invited me to write the text, I think it was quite daunting, the idea to have to define the planetary. And when, you start going into the literature, the different terminologies that are used, a lot of the time there are these sort of conversations about why we use global in this context and not in that context, and planetary means this and global means that. I sort of, I was thinking about this before, in terms of how I approach it, I think we also have to bear in mind, the context of the art world, right? I'm an art writer, and so, the fact that I was able to participate in 52 artists and 52 actions was something that facilitated an approach that in many ways is quite good. It's defined by the way that I myself move through the art world, if you see what I mean. And of course in the art world, these questions of what does it mean to be global, how do we communicate with one another across global space without sort of falling into homogenizing tendencies, is a big one and a common one I think that many people share. So, yes, so after I wrote this essay, I did move into research into, I was looking into Hildegund's work, the sprawl and Eurasia, which we're looking at Russian propaganda and the concept of Eurasia itself, as with the neo-Eurasians as proposed by Amanshauser. And in turn, that sort of led to a investigation into certain problematic signs that have kind of changed meaning in really quite dramatic ways, one of which was Pepe the Frog, who I don't know if everyone knows was was the creation of the cartoonist named Matt Fury that became an underground symbol and of the alt-right in the US and was eventually the prophetic hate symbol, which surfaced in 2019. It became a hate symbol and was, in 2016 when it became very much associated with Donald Trump's election. And then in 2019 he resurfaced in Hong Kong as a symbol of the democratic movement there. So, I guess in a way you can say how has the research developed? I think that, maybe it has developed in the sense that the fluidity of signs and the fluidity of words and concepts, words as signs and concepts that are attached to them are very much at play right now. Yeah, I don't know if that was quite meandering.
We may have to cut you short because we started so late. Does that make sense, Hildegund? Yes? Thank you so much for the really comprehensive description of your essay. It's in here. The actual image that Stephanie referred to is on the cover of our book. This was the first shot of the Earth taken by an astronaut. He was actually upside down and caught Africa, Antarctica, and part of the Arab Peninsulas here, and what we did on the cover is turn it 90 degrees. We failed to mention that in our intro, but Stephanie refers also to the same image in its original form. Thank you, and thank you for putting up with our...
Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you so much for all of your contributions, and thank you for being patient through the technical difficulties. Thank you.
So again, I want to start first with thanks to Hildegund and Kimberly. They've been incredibly patient and very generous, and I just have to say patient again, trying to get me here through all of the logistic hassles. as having a US passport in Europe is not what it used to be. As someone who has been based in Croatia for a while, I've been following the Planetary symposiums and the programming of Salzburg Summer Academy, which is really something truly remarkable in the region. So for me, it's quite an honor to be here. It's quite an honor to contribute to this publication. Hold on, sorry, it's on a slideshow that I did not intend. There we go. So I will say, though, that when Kimberly first reached out to me with the idea about writing about this particular piece, Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña's Couple in a Cage, Two Amera Indians Visit the West, I did have to hesitate. It's not a work that I thought that much about previously. It's not a work that I feel completely comfortable with still, even having spent at least 2 months going back and forth through it. So this work was originally conceived in 1991-1992 to mark the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's landing in the New World, which is very central to the American myth of what the American, and when I say American, it will normally mean the United States of America. But again, as part of this American myth, this United States has tended to overshadow the rest of North and South America. But anyway, the piece was titled to... Do I need to unmute, or is everything okay? Anyway. The piece was conceived to mark the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus. For the piece, the two artists revived the tradition of human zoos, which many of you might know already, but were popular at the turn of the century, particularly for large expos like World's Fairs, and particularly for colonizing nations or former colonizing nations who needed reassuring that the othering they used to justify their exploitation of faraway lands, maybe it might actually be based in some sort of fact or ethnographic justification they could use that would allow them to sidestep moral or ethical obligations to other human beings. See, they're not like us, we have civilization and they have authenticity. And authenticity is something that will come up a lot in this piece. So as Hildegund said, the piece first opened in Madrid in a public square. It was shown in many different venues, and I get into this more in the book, but I'm going to try and keep this condensed so that we have time for discussion. So I'm going to focus on some of the points of overlap with Sanjukta's essay as well. But in addition to Madrid, where it was shown as part of the Edge 92 Biennale, is this...
We should say unmute.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure if that was... So before it was in Madrid, as Hildegund said, but it also traveled to London's Covent Garden, Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., which is a particularly interesting context, the Whitney Biennale in New York, which was a particularly uninteresting context to me, the Australian Museum of Natural History in Sydney, and the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, which stands out because Chicago was one of these cities that hosted a World's Fair replete with a human zoo as part of the 1893 World Columbian Exposition. So for the piece, Fusco and Gomez Peña dolled up as natives, and you can kind of see here, feathered headdresses, grass skirts. Coco Fusco had this leopard print bikini she wore, but they also mixed it up with like designer sunglasses and Converse sneakers, so to kind of throw people off. They presented themselves as members of the lost tribe of the fictional island of Guantanamo, which was a name that sort of riffed off of several things. The Guanahani, which was an island in the Bahamas where Christopher Columbus first landed, and then the phrase, "What now?" So I'm like, what else? So over the course of the performance, which either lasted a few hours or could even last several days depending on the venue, the artists would present themselves to the public caged in a kind of ethnographic burlesque. As part of it, guards would feed the Guantanamese through the cage's bars. Come on, there you go. So there she's feeding Guillermo Gomez Peña, and I think is a hot dog with her gloved hand. In exchange for donations for the crowd, Gomez Peña would share authentic stories in a sort of nonsense babble that would contain a lot of international brand names as well. And Fusco would exuberantly bop along to hip-hop for her authentic tribal dance. When they weren't performing, the couple would lounge around with their laptops, stitching up voodoo dolls. They would sometimes read postmodern theory, or they would pose for Polaroids with visitors who coughed up a nominal fee, either $1 or $2. You can see some of those visitors getting their souvenir photograph right now. For the Whitney performance, the artist upped the ante by offering a glimpse at real Guantanamo genitalia for the bargain price of $5. Although those who actually paid would find that when Gomez Peña lifted up his grass skirt, he had arranged himself so everything had remained concealed. Of course, this kind of spectacle wouldn't be possible today. In an era of smartphones, it takes a few seconds to figure out that the people in the cage are not who they say they are. But at the time, in 1992 and 1993, Fusco and Gomez Peña came bearing their own credentials. They had prepared these didactic panels that emulated articles from Encyclopedia Britannica, talking about what is the Amerindian. The pseudo-scholarly description of the specimens would list their average height and weight before adding details like the male likes spicy food, burritos, and Diet Coke, and his favorite cigarette brand is Marlboro. The female, meanwhile, is fond of sandwiches, pad thai, and herbal tea. So on hand to corroborate these facts was a guide who would have a Ask Me button on, as well as an assistant on hand to take photographs. Because even before Instagram, it was something that you were supposed to photograph was understood to be more important than something you were just supposed to look at. On a less sarcastic level, Coco Fusco also compiled a list of instances of intercultural performance, which I'm not sure if you can read any of them here, but I exerted a few of them because they're quite interesting. So these are not just the human zoos that I mentioned earlier, but things like, you have Pocahontas here, or the so-called Indian that Shakespeare modeled Caliban off of. These go all the way back to the Caribbean native that Columbus supposedly brought back as a gift to the Spanish court, who was said to have died of a broken heart 2 years after he arrived. All the way up to Tiny Tisha, the island princess, who was on display at the Minnesota State Fair in 1992, about the same time they were making this performance. So one thing that Coco Fusco has done a lot of writing about the piece, both before, during, and after. And one thing she makes clear is that these people on display were performing. These people in these human zoos were performing. In this text, she's very clear to frame it in that way. This point is taken further in an article that I found extremely helpful during my research for this, which is Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblet's essay, The Ethnographic Burlesque. So the identity that they were acting out was not necessarily their own, but rather one projected upon them by the expectant audience. As Kirshenblatt-Gimlet points out, a lot of the Turks, Egyptians, Irish, and German, because Irish and Germans were also in these human zoos, which is something that blew my mind a little when I first read it, but just shows my ignorance. They were not only performers from the countries that they were purportedly from, but also college students, immigrants, people who needed to pick up some extra cash could pose as one of these authentic spectacles. So in other words, authenticity, that thing that was supposed to contrast with civilization, was never actually on the table. As Kirshenblatt-Gimlet picks up Stephen Mullaney's term rehearsal of culture in her reading of Couple of the Cage, and she writes, while the couple in the cage purports to rehearse a putative ethnographic reality, what it actually rehearses is a mode of encounter. Audiences, assuming the former, get caught in the latter. And I think this kind of catch becomes especially clear in a film that Coco Fusco made with Paula Heredia, which was called The Couple in the Cage, A Guatemala Odyssey, which combines documentation of the performance with with excerpts from older movies, potentially racist sort of coverage of these kinds of human zoos or ethnographic spectacles. This is the tongue-in-cheek cover that you can see here. Since obviously Encyclopedia Britannica is not the only authority people trust. But you can see here two things like museum visitors outraged. So this is, remember I started with my hesitations, and this is one point where they really start to come in. Not just because on the surface the piece is somewhat crude and unsophisticated, but in that I see a clash between its intentions and its execution, mainly in regards to the relationship it forms with the audience, this mode of encounter mentioned. Fusco has written a lot about the project, as I said, including an update last year, or 2 years ago already, when the US started putting people in cages, not as a carnival attraction, but as an official domestic policy. But in one of her texts, her earlier texts, The Other History of Intercultural Performance, which was published in 1994, a year after they stopped doing the piece, she writes, "The cage became a blank screen onto which audiences projected their fantasies of who and what we are. As we assumed the stereotypical role of the domesticated savage, many audience members felt entitled to assume the role of the colonizers, only to find themselves uncomfortable with the implications of the game." So this is what strikes me as somewhat strange, is that in many ways the piece itself, which was kind of formed to poke at this, this wave of multiculturalism that came in with things like Magicien de la Terre and this idea that suddenly recognizing otherness actually just means formalizing it in your mission statement and not actually addressing what it means to have an other, or what it means to need to have another, more pointedly, I guess. So for me, it seems the piece itself seemed predicated on the audience, which was presumably white, gravitating towards the role of the colonizer. A scholar, Diana Taylor, who wrote an excellent response to this piece as well. As she's pointed out, the audience could not win. There was no correct way to respond to the performance. And Coco Fusco goes into some of the various reactions they had from the audience, which range from people in Madrid complaining that their skin was not dark enough, to people in Chicago upset that this was in a museum and that they wanted the museum guards feeling some sort of emotional distress over the course of the performance, to the people getting spit on, sexual harassment, things like this. But I'm not going to catalog all of those, but in short, as Diana Taylor says, Fusco and Gomez Peña enacted the various economies of the object, the body as cultural artifact, as sexual object, and that's a whole other thing, because Fusco also had a lot of responses to putting her own body on display. But so as cultural artifact, as sexual objects, as threatening alterity, as scientific specimen, as living proof of radical difference, they were anything the spectator wanted them to be except human. So they didn't really give, they said it was framed for like a space for reflection, but the way that it was produced and presented, it was more about this immediate encounter and that spark, which Taylor would even argue that the cage and the costumes and the whole outrageousness of it all actually kept things more comfortable for the viewers by providing them the, quote, security of partial recognition, unquote, thus shielding the audience from actually having to face the ramifications of colonialism and genocide as it continued to shape their present. So pointing to Fusco's Cuban heritage and Gomez Peña's own move from Mexico City, Taylor concludes that they really are Guantanis of sorts, though not in their way their spectators are being asked to believe. And I'm going to, as I wrap up, I'm going to quote Taylor at length here because I think she really nails it in a way that connects to our conversation that we were having earlier. For all the trappings of difference, the subjects and objects may be more similar than one imagines. For some viewers, then, the bars of the cage actually protected them against the realization, marking the radical boundary between the here and the there, the us and the them, allowing for no intra, no cross, no transcultural nada. Pre-colonial subjects, frozen in static essence, didn't experience today's hybrid ethnic and racial identities. The native body was believable then, not because it was real or authentic, but precisely because it wasn't. It served to maintain the distance between the pre and the post, the pre-colonial to the post-colonial, the pre-modern to the post-modern. Rather than challenging us to more fully acknowledge the racial and cultural heterogeneity of societies such as Latin America's, in which very real indigenas continue to live in or alongside industrial centers. The pre and the post division hammers in distinct and identifiable boundaries. So in other words, the cage wasn't keeping the artist in so much as keeping the audience out of a reality in which colonial interests still determine their day-to-day lives. And as a last thing I will say, there's a lot more I could say about this, and I did go into some of it in the book, but there's still so much more. But for the sake of brevity, and because I think this fits with our discussion, I did want to point out how day-to-day these realities really are. Not just in America, where we're having the struggles I alluded to earlier, but which are probably in your headlines. But also this morning, as I took a stroll along the river and visited the House to Nature, where I was stunned to have an encounter of my own, which some of you might recognize this or know, but this is one of the dioramas on the ground floor, which is a section on Tibet and Tibetan peoples. And I was talking to Hildegund about this at lunch, and the museum has introduced, well, this is a historical holdover of the museum's original purpose, which was maybe less honorable. Ethnography as justification, like I kind of mentioned earlier. They have put up a text about this historical context and what it means to show these particular dioramas of Tibet. But that kind of text wasn't actually available upstairs when you have a display like this woman from Papua New Guinea, who you'll see in the far corner, who's actually sharing a display case with the taxidermied animals nearby. And these are models, not actual people, obviously, but that's still that framework of it presenting an other in a cage or as spectacle is still quite alive and unaddressed here as well. So with that, I think I might hand it over to Sanjukta. Thank you again for having me here.
So a few years back, quite a few years back now, I began a European Commission-funded project on aesthetics of decolonization. And for a while, I have been working with the idea, and it keeps morphing and expanding and going out of control. Initially, I began by looking at what the aesthetics of decolonization implies in deeply locational contexts. I come from a background in social history. I like to work not with the planetary or global, but distinctly locational histories and vernacular archives. So I began with what role the displacements that followed the trail of decolonization, particularly in my geographical context of South Asia, how that made artists encounter the idea of freedom. As the project moved, I encountered an ever-expanding body of archive, and Lotus itself was a part of it. And I started trying to figure out how am I going to conceptualize the transnational? How do I bring it into this broader question of aesthetics of decolonization? And this article in particular, despite being short, actually helped me conceptualize what the trans means. So the title of the piece is Trans Imaginaries of Decolonization. It's a proposition. The article, it's not a full work. It is a proposition. So I try to present three frames through which we can look at the art of a periodical like Lotus. And I looked at three frames. One is a temporal one, a transitional frame, a spatial, a transnational frame, and a more idiomatic, a transcultural frame. And I'll talk a bit more about that. How did I encounter Lotus? That in itself is an interesting juncture, I would say. We were working on a project on the aesthetic forms, the cultural forms the left took in the post-colonial context. Not in the climactic 1940s, which was marked by the final decade of freedom struggle, when there was a left-wing cultural movement, which is in my monograph, which I worked on in the book. the radical cultural movement that the left developed in the 1940s in late colonial contexts. Our question was not to look at the high point of the left during the 40s, but what happened after that? What happened after that high point? What happens after there is displacement? What happens after there is partition and countries are divided and friendships are displaced and solidarities cannot be forged politically, at least poses a challenge. So the idea was to look at post-colonial left. And one of the people in that collective, Dr. Maya Ramanath, brought in her work on lotus. And she was also beginning to think about it. Now we are doing an edited volume and Maya is actually writing on lotus. And Maya brought in the way in which lotus becomes a forum in which South Asian left from the 1940s, 50s, they again emerge in, some of the protagonists of the cultural left from India and Pakistan emerge in lotus in the 1970s. So that's how I encountered lotus. And it struck me for a set of reasons that I will kind of go into. So, as you can see, lotus here, this is the insignia of lotus. This is also the insignia of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Association that was formed in the mid-late 1950s following the Bandung Conference, where Afro-Asian nations came together to visualize what freedom would mean. Some countries that had gained independence and others who were fighting for independence. So lotus is organically tied to this moment of forging an Afro-Asian solidarity, and that's there. And then the Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement had a writers' wing called Afro-Asian Writers that was formed in the late 50s in Cairo, with a wing initially in Colombo. So in itself, it was a transnational formation. So we are talking about Bandung in Indonesia, Colombo, Delhi, Tehran, and then Cairo. So this is the kind of broad geography within which this body is operating. So one of the first things that struck me about Lotus was that it's obviously trying to visualize what Afro-Asian solidarity would mean. And that was looking at also Kate's, what Kate had to say. Ultimately, it is a battle around representation. And I think Lotus form comes at that moment when Afro-Asian peoples, at least rhetorically, are trying to imagine what would representing ourselves look like. So Lotus to me is very much a work in progress, a thought in progress, also for people who were contributing in the journal itself. Striking in Lotus to me was how marginal visuals were to Lotus, or the particular role visuals played in Lotus. You had a set of iconic artists whose works were published, but mainly these were untitled, anonymous illustrations. So I guess being a historian, I was drawn to the most kind of undefined, tricky terrain, which was the space of illustrations in Lotus. And the questions I began with was, what work are illustrations doing, and how can we really go into the context from which Lotus was being made, even though it talks about a transnational aesthetic. So one of the first things, of course, is that Lotus is trying to visualize solidarity. One way in which that is happening is through imagining categories like Afrasia. If you go deeper into it, the article talks about it. It talks about Afrasia, blacks and whites, a new humanity on the march, irresistibly against the forces of destruction and so on. And you have this kind of visualization of solidarity. Another visualization of solidarity is from the Senegalese film director, Ousmane Sembene, who talks about, there is this poem that he puts in, and he talks about the finger of the artist, the fingers of the guerrilla fighter, and the finger of the worker and the peasant. So there is a kind of socialist vocabulary that's very active in Lotus throughout, but the solidarity is not just racial, there is also a very class war, guerrilla warfare kind of driven solidarity that is being visualized. So these are the kind of the registers of solidarity. Another thing that struck me is that another mode of visualizing solidarity is actually through anonymity and through montage. Looking at Lotus, and in the past 2 years, I have been working on Lotus since 2018, and every time I go back to Lotus, this is something I grapple with, these are anonymous paintings, not that one, that's by Ismail Shamout, a famous Palestinian painter, but images like this, where you have And I just want you to dwell on this a bit, where you have a poem on Patrice Lumumba, Congo, a poem, memorializing him. The poems are written by Sahil Ludhianvi here, who's one of the iconic figures of the South Asian left, by the Japanese Katsumi Sugawara, again, a very iconic poet in Japan, and the painting that might be from a completely different context. The poem is not by a Japanese artist, it is not by a South Asian artist, most certainly not by a Congolese artist, and I'll tell you why I think so. The end of Lotus, the last page of Lotus, it has the name of the illustrators. And in my own way, and using Wikipedia substantially, I've tried to figure out who these people were because they are not very famous. And what I have found is that most of them are just book illustrators working in late 1960s Cairo. And that point is important in itself, and I'll come to that later. So you have this kind of montage, and that's a transnationality that is visualized within the page, right? So there is a way in which that happens. There again, you have a poem on Vietnam in the late 1960s, and then the illustration that follows is from a Palestinian refugee camp. So you have a kind of historical montage of two contexts of displacement also. Again, a very important thing, and just to introduce you to what pages of Lotus look like, there is a way in which the guerrilla warrior is foregrounded. So the decolonization not only as a struggle against colonialism, but and something that is remote and over, even for contexts in Asia, but decolonization through Cold War, and what kind of what ongoing struggles look like. So freedom not as a post-colonial condition, but freedom as a wider decolonial, neo-imperialist question, right? So you have the guerrilla fighter being foregrounded, but also refugees and displacement and refugee camps being given a visual space, a visual form beyond reportage as art. And it is interesting how visualizing the refugee or visualizing the refugee camp in the late 1960s, if we look at a wider body of visual culture, is pretty active at that point of time. And not just in terms of documentary photography, but artists who are trying to, and through what trajectories artists enter those spaces of refugee camps, that in itself is another kind of question which one could pursue. So the guerrilla fighter and the refugees also something that as content in Lotus is very active. The other work that Lotus does, and this is again in continuation to the question of solidarity, is it tries to visualize, it tries to give an aesthetic form to the transnational question. So not only the transnational spread, that is Afro-Asia, but the transnational question, what is the South? And how are we going to imagine the South, the cultural questions from the South? What are the questions in hand? So there are some, again, many of these paintings are anonymous. Salah Sadek isn't, but there are many others where the name of the artist is not mentioned. So you have across the color line, the very idea of the color line, which was made active by Richard Wright in the 1950s after he visited Bandung, that, the iron curtain and the color curtain. So the questioning, so the question of color becomes very active, and how color then is an idiom that has to be addressed as we think about cultures of the South. Again, there are articles like this, some aspects of literature and language in the developing countries. This is pretty early on for this kind of vocabulary. We talk about post-colonial studies and the post-colonial questions, and we pretend that it's the 1990s when these kind of questions came up. So Lotus, and that's why I said it's a work in progress even for the editors. And you can see how these ideas are bristling, as it were. Aesthetic criteria and mutual influence of different cultures. Also up there, Faiz Ahmed Faiz, an iconic left-wing poet from South Asia, the artist's role in a developing country. So these are thoughts in progress. These are propositions from the authors. Sometimes you see very tricky political ground being some of them were left-wing figures who were already co-opted by the nation state. So they do this difficult dance between nationalism and internationalism. So these pieces are full of contradictions, but it's interesting to see how that work of imagination is at play. As I move towards wrapping up, I want to also talk about Lotus, the very context of the late 1960s, and why, and also for me, it's a work in progress. I do not know where I'm going to take this work. I don't see it coming up in the next book, but it'll continue to be a parallel project, and there are many directions in which this is going to go in my work, and I've looked at some of the archives, not all. One point that I want to mention as I wrap up is the importance of the late 1960s, and I'm sure this will come up as we discuss what the role of a journal, a periodical like Lotus is, which received funding from the Soviet Union in the late 1960s. Maybe we'll come to that in the discussion. But it is the importance of the late 1960s that I just want to flag here, and maybe we can come back to it later. We have the first Tricontinental Conference in 1966. We have the 1967 Six Days War, in which Israel finally defeats the Arab army and occupies Palestine. And that plays a very important role in Egypt in the late 1960s. And that context of the late 1960s in Egypt influences who does what in Lotus. So one point that I would like to mention is that while we talk about transnational forums and the Planetary, many of these are deeply rooted in locational histories. And Lotus, while it is trying to imagine Afro-Asian solidarity and clearly is working with the transnational, has a very rooted vernacular, almost culture tied to it, and that is of Cairo, Egypt in the late 1960s. And there, the question of the Palestinian refugees and refugee camps in Jordan, these become very active in Lotus. So my next work that I'm working on, Bangladeshi, but previously East Pakistani artists in the 50s and 60s, and one of them, Zainul Abidin, in the late 1960s, around the same time as Lotus is being published actually, goes to Jordan and visits Cairo. I'm still to find out whether he met the people who were working for Lotus. It's likely, but depends on what his son shows me. But some of the material of artists like Abedin traveling from what was then East Pakistan, soon to become Bangladesh, traveling to this region out of solidarity and being invited by the Arab League. So I'm also trying to figure out the wider political economy within which Lotus as a journal is operating. The other is, again, it's tied to the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Movement. It is an album of caricatures that was published in 1968 from Beijing by the Afro-Asian Journalists Association. So as a researcher who's just about entering this field and talking about the Planetary, often we are talking about planetary archives also. So how do we really work our ways through this transnational archives in terms of sheer money, in terms of Corona times, how do we actually manage to go to our archives? And then what role collaboration then plays in getting access to. So this is one of those kind of very serendipitous kind of moments when I came across this journal which carried caricatures from the late 1960s, visualizing Afro-Asian solidarity, but also then harvesting artworks, harvesting cartoons from communist parties across Africa and Asia. And this, for instance, is the organ of the Malagasy Communist Party. And you can see how, and that gives you a sense of how journals like Lotus or forums like this were harvesting visuals. So a broader field that I'm interested in, and I'll close with that, is what is the visual culture of solidarity? At that point of time, in the 50s also, 50s, 60s, 70s. So my questions are historical. These have resonances for our times. The question of decolonization and the decolonial, like Kate, we can talk about that later, are very active, but often we do not think about what decolonization meant in these decades and what are the archives of freedom, really. So it is the question of freedom that I'm interested, freedoms rather, that I'm interested in. And basically at this stage, I'm looking at any kind of archival footprint around this. So if any of you have any pointers, the most welcome. But to me, Lotus basically sits at the juncture. Lotus started in 1967. It continued till 1989. Not surprising, because it was funded by the Soviet Union. It was a reaction to another kind of Cold War politics, but maybe we can talk about that later. I have been told that Lotus is revived now, after 2016, but it looks very different. Its ideological baggage is very different, and its transnational address is very different. Latin America is now a part of it. But so in a way, Lotus is both like a very contextual, a very timely, and very contradictory publication. And its visuals kind of echo that difficulty of the 60s and 70s. So it's that difficulty intellectually is quite appealing to me. I'm going to stop here and maybe come back to this later in the questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We have a brief discussion now. I think these two case studies are anyway not comparable, but they bring up ideas which I would think we could discuss now, and coming from the past also go into contemporary and future also. So the first question would bring up the question of whiteness and blackness, and this question, I mean, which is very vivid at the moment with Black Lives Matters, for example, and the question of, and you have it in the logo of Lotus also, you have a white person and a black person, and the question I would like to pose is the West and the non-West, and the question of indigenous people, their visibility and their being integrated or not integrated into this discourse of blackness and whiteness.
Do you mind if I start?
Oh, please, please.
Yeah, I'm going to jump on this one first, just because at this particular moment, this contrast of black and white is quite relevant in the United States, as Hildegund mentioned, but also all over the world, as people are kind of reevaluating certain relationships. One thing that struck me there is that all the conversations that are being, or that most of the conversations that are being had in the States at this moment are still, they're focusing on a reckoning with slavery and a reckoning with a certain kind of embedded racism, a certain kind of racism that was necessitated by the capital system, that was propagated, that was supported, actively supported in the country. But in addressing those, you see institutions putting out their stickers and their signs and whatever, their symbols of support and solidarity, their idea of what solidarity might look like. But it's also ignoring a large part of the conversation, which is also the idea of genocide. I realize in retrospect I probably sounded too harsh on the couple in the cage, but one thing that was really illuminating for me is, again, how relevant the conversation around indigeneity is in the United States right now. There maybe was a blip in the news a few weeks ago when Donald Trump wanted to have a photo shoot at Mount Rushmore. And it brought up, oh, well, actually, Mount Rushmore is not actually American land. It belongs to these tribes. These were sacred mountains. And for a minute, people started to say, oh, maybe we should reconsider our relationship to the Native Americans and the population that was here before the country initiated its wide-scale genocide, which is really the roots of America. I mean, it's one way, the Columbus myth is one way to get around talking about that, and it's made it very easy. So I think considering right now that kind of case, and considering some of the conversations we were having even about the definition of Asia and Afro solidarity, I think that that in some ways having these tough conversations, tough necessary conversations, also allows other conversations to kind of fall through the cracks for the time being. So I think one of the things with this moment, this particular moment, and this pause we're having, is that potential for a more wide-scale reimagining or reevaluating of these myths and these stories and these representations we've been telling ourselves. So maybe I'll let you.
Yeah. The question of indigeneity and indigenous populations. I guess one reason for Black and White in Lotus is because it was a cheap publication and black and white are. There's a lot of orange also, but jokes apart, I think the question of indigeneity leads to actually a broader crisis and a crisis of solidarity, I would say. The race question is such that it has been assumed that post-colonial nations are then on the receiving end of racism, and therefore they are partners in forging Afro-Asian solidarity or a post-colonial solidarity. But many of you will know that in 2020 we are standing and grappling with the question of the decolonial, transforming the colonial gaze, not only following what came after, which is the post-colonial. And a part of the decolonial gaze is to then also look into the post-colonial and what are the blind spots of the post-colonial. And my argument would be that color is a blind spot in the post-colonial context also. So talking about the Black Lives Matter, if I just look at the United States and I look at activists who are working in the United States, let's say the colored, the brown diaspora in the United States who are active in the Black Lives Matter movement, a broader question that is being raised is that how alert are they to the question of color active within South Asia? And here, of course, I'm talking about the broader question of caste and the question of Dalits in India, who are historically ostracized. We are not even talking about marginalized community. We are talking about ostracism. We are talking about people who actually do not see themselves, who cannot even enter the national paradigm. Right? So there is a wider question that is being discussed in Facebook. I'm not on Instagram, so I do not know what revolution is happening there. But at least in Facebook, people are asking, when will the Dalit Lives Matter hashtag start? And how are South Asian activists going to enter that conversation? Are you really going to look into the firmly rooted social conditioning? So even if one grows up without an awareness of caste, somehow Dalits are in the margins of that consciousness. So how are post-colonial nations going to look at their own marginalizations that are at play? There is another hashtag going on, again, not particularly to answering the indigenous question. Will there be a hashtag called Kashmiri Lives Matter? India, as we speak, is putting academics behind bars. So I do not see that hashtag coming up in India anytime soon. Not to mention that, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, also that will not happen. So there are limits of solidarity, and I think the decolonial moment is posing questions where I think post-colonial societies will have to rethink ideas of solidarity that they forged in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So it's a time of reckoning, and I think the reckoning is much broader than a black and white reckoning. So I think there is no resolution. It depends where the discourse goes and where people, so the indigenous question, and also Dalit activists do not see the conversation happening within the structure of the national paradigm. Dalit activists see an internationalist solidarity, and I just want to say this here, in the 70s also, they saw it as an international question. So for example, in the early 70s, and I don't read Marathi, but there is an archive in vernacular Marathi out there of Dalit activists forming forums in the 1970s called the Dalit Panthers that were very actively influenced by the Black Panthers. In fact, their icon was also the Black Panther. And there is a wider history. There are so many people who are working on the Black Panthers movement and the transnational scope of the Black Panthers movement. So if one really has to look at Dalit aesthetics and the radical edge of Dalit aesthetics in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we might have to go to another kind of internationalism, whether it is India, whether it is post-coloniality, it will not speak to them. So maybe indigeneity will put forward questions that go beyond post-colonial frameworks. because post-colonial solidarity doesn't work for them. But it's a very important question. In Leiden, very recently, a friend of mine who's also a curator at the Volkenkunde Museum, which is the ethnographic museum, she curated an exhibition on the First Nations. And one of the questions that came up in a launch like this was, but what about Black Lives Matter? So people think that, somehow now we have to talk about Black Lives Matter, and that's great. But there are these wider intersectionalities at best that want to come to the fore too. So I feel solidarity it's a bit of an open frame now, and there are many stakeholders, justifiably so, and some of these conversations are difficult ones. But yeah, I think that's just
I would like
two
to
pennies.
take up the thread of solidarity and go beyond 1989.
Yeah.
Because at the time of Lotus, it was the Soviet Union who was a big sponsor for the left and also for all these discussions. And my question would be, looking into contemporary or also into the future, what are the new formats? What are the new Lotus, for example? How do we need sponsors? Who are the new sponsors? So what came after Lotus in a way, yeah? Or what should come, or what are we hoping for?
You're looking at me. I do not know, of course, digital publishing, blogs. I'm thinking of open democracy forums like that. The forums of what is transnational have changed. Lotus, of course, was being published in the late 1960s. But on the point of Soviet funding, I would like to say there is a line of scholarship who argue, and there is reason in that Lotus comes up pretty late. 1967, 68 is a bit late, I would say. Soviet Union should have kicked into action probably earlier. But it's actually very interesting to see that 66, 67 is also the period when there is the scandal that is exposed, and it is, intellectuals across the Afro-Asian world globally come to know that very, very renowned journals like Encounter in London, or what was it, Hivar in Beirut, or Transition in Kampala in Africa. These were journals that were covertly funded by the Congress of Cultural Freedom, that was covertly funded by the CIA. Mm-hmm. So Lotus almost comes as a reaction to that. Maybe that is a reason why it was late, but there are many other ways in which Soviet Union funneled money into different post-colonial contexts. Now, I think I could give some examples of what my father calls left of left of left, which is another way of saying Maoists. There are ways in which Maoist forums and the far left have funded platforms. And that's because they cannot come to the open in a particular way. In India, Maoists are seen as terrorists. So there are covert forums in which this kind of funding operates, this kind of movement of arms operates. Transnationally, I do not know what the forums are. But I guess my idea would be countercurrents or open democracy. There are ways in which solidarities are being sustained. And that does not always require a lot of money because it is online. And post-COVID times, we are being able, I think it's going to get a huge boost. And we are living in such times where all kinds of intersections, so people who really want to have those difficult conversations will find forums. And do not, and the question of money is diluted further. You do not really have to be present somewhere. So very recently, we had Cornel West and I forget her name, a Dalit activist and a Kashmiri activist coming together in a conversation online, and which many of us... Who?
Was it Surat? It was a male Dalit activist.
No, that's recent. I'm talking about 1-2 months back. So people like us who suppose teach post-colonial theory, we are then being able to see the question of black identity, Dalit identity, and Kashmiri identity coming together in a conversation. It doesn't require much money, but it requires people being, at least one of them having institutional affiliation. That helps. So I think there are different modes. I think the question is different, and therefore it's difficult to track where the money is coming from. Unless you are George Soros and in East Europe, you can trace the money coming from a good.
I would like to bring in Kate because you have been living in post-Soviet and post-communist countries for so long. And so how do you perceive this question of solidarity?
Okay. I'm not going to have as coherent an explanation or answer here, I think, mainly because I'm still wrapping my head around it, what solidarity looks like. For me, if anything, the past few months have really sort of decimated my idea of what was global. I think when we're talking about the planetary versus global, even thinking about some of those questions now seems not irrelevant, but just going in another direction. I mean, a lot of this is coming out of the experience of this sort of resurgence of borders in a way that we've seen the last 5 years in Europe, but that have always existed in certain regions and have not necessarily been the conversations at the forefront, but, you know, like Kashmir and things like this that have, the border has always been. So I think in terms of sponsorship, I'm also going to lean in the direction where I'm not sure that sponsorship plays the same role. It's kind of larger. I think what we're seeing is smaller conversations that are happening on local levels, even if those local levels are dispersed geographically. I think there's still these sort of pods and hubs of communication that might not necessarily lead to a greater transnational one unity or solidarity. I think it's going to be a little model. I mean, again, this is kind of coming off of a lunchtime conversation, but I'm not sure we're going to see these kinds of swells that people have hoped for, that I would hope for. That's not a very optimistic answer, but.
I would like to ask the audience, do you have questions, urgent questions? We can propose later. Yeah. Rosalyn, is there a microphone? You should.
They can have this.
Here.
We can move. This one.
Okay.
This one can't be on anyway, because it distracts that one.
Very small question. I'd like to ask, when you were researching on Lotus, what was the ratio of male contributors to female contributors? Because when we talk about solidarities, and especially these left movements, we forget that a lot of the subjectivity is a male subjectivity that's, you know, defining what we conceive of even as solidarity. And I think it's really important to puncture that and to remind ourselves that there is, again, an alternative subjectivity that was perhaps articulated in various other ways, like, you know, maybe through housekeeping magazines. What did it look like in Lotus, this ratio?
Thanks. That was a great question. It's making me think. I can count the number of women who's.
Yeah, that doesn't bode well.
That doesn't bode well. But that doesn't bode well. But I'll just tell you what the genres are. So, for example, in Lotus, there is poems by Amrita Pritam, who's one of the iconic Punjabi socialist poets in the mid-20th century India. Her poems are published. There is this artist who I cannot track, and Wikipedia is also not helping, Hiba Inayat, whose illustrations are published. And the only information I got was she was part of an Arab mission to China in 1962 as a part of like a delegation. So there are clearly women who are hiding within these wider structures of solidarity, and you see them as flashes, like, and you do what you do with that. Again, there is an anthropological kind of piece in Lotus by one of the artists in India who I have worked on, but that is not around her art, but her documentation of indigenous people in India. Meera Mukherjee, the sculptor. So there are these flashes, but I just wanted to, just thinking about when Kate was talking, about what kind of solidarity, people who are writing in Lotus are often not only male, but they are officials, or they are very important cultural figures, whether it is Faiz Ahmed Faiz or Mulk Rajan and whatever. These are, by that time, the key figures. So Lotus often was heavily dominated by important figures, which was probably important in the 60s, but now, just responding to Kate a bit, it's way more micro and scattered and chaotic. We have our kind of chaos. So no, the gender question is not active in Lotus at all, unless you push it that way and you really filter. Freedom is. Yeah.
How many examples were printed from, do you know, from Lotus usually? I mean, how many examples spread?
Editions. So I see Lotus was published, the Arabic version was published in, the Arabic and French versions were published in Cairo and Beirut, and then the English version was published from the GDR. My idea would be that it had quite a good circulation. And because I've tried to trace, at least in the South Asian context, people whose writings are coming up, are appearing in Lotus, and I can absolutely see how they would subscribe to Lotus. Like, I can see how it is operating. But then again, that's through my knowledge of these people in this little corner in India. But if you start exploring those corners in, in Senegal or in South Africa or in other contexts, then I think you will see that it has but it is a partisan subscription. So yeah, it has that kind of world. I have a feeling it's widely circulated, but most of these people are dead. So unless their families show us their archives, we don't really know. But yeah.
Are there other questions? No, so I would suggest to make a 10 or 15 minutes break, and you keep distance and go up and everything like that. So thank you both very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me back this year. It's a hat trick. It's my third time in Salzburg, and it feels like it's really come full circle for me. And as Kimberly just mentioned, the first time I came here was 2 summers ago as a correspondent with Contemporary and to write about... Sorry.
Yeah, for the Zoom, it's super important that you're very close. I was on it before, and when someone's a bit back, you can't hear them anymore.
How's this? Louder, I can hear myself. Yeah, so when I came to Salzburg 2 summers ago, I was writing for Contemporary and about the conference, which would eventually become this book. And it was interesting writing about this, because it was, I got the commission around the time I was trying to decide what to do with my life, per se. I think by the time we had first met, I'd been living in Berlin for about a year. I had started out writing as a freelancer, and I pivoted from music over to art, and I realized that art writing was what I truly wanted to pursue. And so it was really wonderful to get this commission to write about an alternative arts pedagogical program that is decentered from the West. Now, as Kimberly also mentioned, I'm at the Courtauld Institute, so whilst I was writing about this incredibly radical, incredibly progressive non-institution in West Africa, I ended up enrolling in one of the most conservative art history institutes, I guess, in the world. And it was really interesting as a first-year student, my first term, doing this research, conducting these interviews on the backdrop of my own education. So I haven't actually been to the Raw Material Company. I would love to go. I want to apply for the next session, next year actually. So when I was doing the research for this article, I mostly had calls with Eva Barada Keval, who I now believe she has left the team at Raw. She is a Senegalese French curator, and when she was with the Raw Material Company, she was based more or less half the year in Paris and the other half of the year in Dakar in Senegal. And I was also corresponding with Dulcie Atlas and Koyo Kuo, who is the founder of this program. Koyo is a Cameroonian curator, and she has been active everywhere. She was involved in the Bamako Biennale. She's been very active in Europe, particularly in Switzerland. Now she's joined the Zeitmocker team in Cape Town, and she founded the Raw Material Company in 2008. I'm gonna say straight off the bat, it's not a school. That was a quote that a refrain that recurred quite often in my research. Koyo stresses that it's not a school, and yes, these negations, these denials of what they're doing at the raw material company as being in any way in close proximity to Western pedagogical models ended up kind of being the theme that, the string that draws this entire text together. A phrase that also came up a lot was this idea that the raw material company is an organic imposition. So I guess when it was first founded in 2008, property was acquired in a residential neighborhood in Dakar, which was used as a multi-purpose space. It was used as an exhibition space. They also based a library there. They had office space there, accommodation for people who were joining at the academy, residents. It was really a space for interdisciplinary art practice and pedagogy. Again, I hesitate to use the word that it's a school. I hesitate to use the term education because it really is a site of symbiotic, very organic, again, intercultural, interpersonal exchange and development. And, I have very little teaching experience, but I did also find, and helped me understand when I was writing this, that the best teaching experiences come obviously when you learn something yourself, and that is very much the case, what they're doing in Senegal. When I was doing the research for this piece, I watched a speech that Koyo gave at the first symposium, the first Global Academy Symposium in 2016 in Salzburg, where she referred to Douala art in Cameroon, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that. And I could confidently say that Douala art, which was founded in the 80s, I believe, I forgot the exact year, it's in the essay, so you have to buy a copy. It formed very much the basis of what Koyo wanted to do, in that, as I just mentioned, it was a multi-purpose space in which people from across Africa, not so much Europe at the time, it was much harder to travel, but people across Africa, creative people, artists, art practitioners could come and collaborate and work with each other, host exhibitions, etc., etc. And when I was thinking about this phrase, radical creativity, I was reminded of a video I watched on Twitter. It was an excerpt taken from a documentary which was screened on Arte. And in this video, excuse me, because I'm paraphrasing Fred Moten, who in this video was paraphrasing Frank Wilderson. And he spoke about how inspired he was when Frank would talk about staying in the hold. And by that, he was referring to being in the hold of a ship that was crossing the Atlantic at any point during the transatlantic slave trade. And staying in the hold as Fred explained it, excuse me, is being in a place where all one can do is speculate, where there is only ever possibility for the most radical imagination because you could never be more confined. And I was very moved by that, and I found it, I was just thinking about it earlier today when we were having lunch, and I thought it quite nicely complemented also my case study being in the present section of the book. I'll just pivot back to the essay. When we were editing, I really struggled to write the conclusion. I was meant to write, what is the future of the raw material company? I asked Ava, and she was just like, I don't really know. She could only tell me what was immediately going to happen. So back to the structure of what they do. The majority of my essay focuses on the Raw Academy, which is a pseudo-residency program that they've been running for 8 sessions now, as they call them, which are biannual convergences of artists, curatorial graduates, students, people who are interested in art practice and arts education alongside a faculty. So there'd be one person invited as the main faculty, and that person, so most recently that person was the French filmmaker Eric Baudelaire. That person would then invite colleagues, contemporaries of theirs to form the rest of the faculty, and then together over the course of 7 weeks, the faculty and 11 or 12 students, or fellows as they call them at the Raw Material Company, will come together and take part in screenings and talks, collaborations, workshops, etc. And so Ava was only really able to tell me that they're going to have 2 more academies, after which they're hoping to focus more on the raw base, which is the archive and library portion of the Raw Material Company. And just referring to what Fred Moten was saying about radical creativity and staying in the hold, creating these, as Adrian Piper would refer to them, these indexical presents, in that one must be absolutely present and reflect on the situation as it stands. If we're talking about post-colonialism, talking about radical pedagogy, this unbelievable concentration that can only really come out of the now. So what Raw Material Company are doing, they don't look anything like they did 10 years ago. They used to have an exhibition space, which they completely pivoted away from, and now they're completely non-commercial. What they're doing is reflecting immediately on what's being produced and seeing how that can, be used to take a step forward. They wouldn't plan 1 year, 2 years, 5 years into the future. It simply wouldn't work like that. As post-colonial practice, as I understand it, can't really work like that. We're going to get onto it more, so I'll stop now. Sorry.
Stop.
Yeah, I'll stop now.
We came up with some questions, and I'm wondering, is Rosalyn's mic on? Or does she need to move back and forth? Okay. Another question is, we have little teeny pictures of you two. We have a couple of images. I don't know if it's useful to see the raw material. Like, we've seen this before. Look, back up. That's a promotional picture from Dhaka Art Summit. I think it's from 2 years ago. It was a sculpture in one of the main academy spaces working with children. I don't know how representative that is, but interaction with almost 500,000 people happening this year too. And the next one, you do see the exterior of Raw Material Academy, or Raw Material Company, sorry, in Decolonization, just to get an idea of what it looks like. We came up with some questions for ourselves, and we discussed them also over lunch and via email. Sanjukta, you before mentioned the term decolonization. It appears all over this book. We have a whole essay or interview of Charles Escher on decolonization of the Planetary Museum. It's a thread. What I want to ask you guys is, or what a question that one of you actually brought up, is what decolonization actually looks like in practice. And I'm wondering if these case studies showed you, is the Raw Material Company an effort at decolonization? Is it something else? How would we define it? What about Dhaka Art Summit?
To pick up kind of where I just left off, I do struggle to apply the term decolonization, or even to refer to present times as being post-colonial, because I do believe that simply, it refers to the physical removal, perhaps, of imperial forces, perhaps changing a few street names, the literal closing down of a government agency building. But to, as people often say, to decolonize minds, to decolonize education, that would require the unraveling of a history longer than any of us could ever consider or truly rationalize. And as Kate was talking about earlier, violence is an inherent tool. It's a means of imperialism. It's a means of decolonization and colonialism. And there is nothing we could do today to, by any means, undo, reflect on, or let alone unravel all of that. I think I see evidence of decolonization in what's going on with the Raw Material Company because of their ability to be so agile and flexible in the way they develop their program, their ability to pivot and engage with new means of education that detract from the Western models that we have, gotten very used to. And again, as we were saying earlier at lunch, it's incredibly difficult to imagine anything different than what we have. There are so many models which are based on things, but to conceptualize something that doesn't yet exist is, as Fred Mosen was saying, is completely radical. It's a radical creativity that requires one to enter into a mind space that just isn't so logical. And that really came across when I was doing my interviews with the different staff members at the Raw Material Company, their ability to think outside of the box and their willingness to engage in interdisciplinary practice. So a little bit of context about the university I go to in case anyone doesn't know. The Courtauld Institute, they only teach art history, which at the time was something quite attractive to me because I thought it would mean I would have a very focused education. And now it's part of the University of London, which involves UCL, King's, Imperial, Goldsmiths, etc. But unfortunately, we don't really have any sort of intercollegiate interaction, which I think is a waste. I don't think you can't talk about European art history, Asian art history, African art history, any art history, without considering the actual history of these places. And in order to do that, you need to look into gender studies. You need to, as we're discussing, look into post-colonial studies. And there is evidence of that at the Raw Material Company. If you were to look on their website, you can see the faculties which joined at the past sessions over the past 4 or 5 years. And many of these people are coming from radically different backgrounds, not only creative backgrounds. People aren't just coming out of prestigious European art academies, and they're coming with a lot to offer that otherwise wouldn't be privy to art students like myself in the more traditional institutions.
Can Raw Material Company be this agile mostly because they decouple themselves from the market? They close their actual exhibition space.
Yeah, I like to hope so. I hope so. I mean, I think being a radical arts institution that chooses to open in a non-European, non-Western country, and I mean, in a pretty hard to access Western African country, I would also say it's quite expensive to travel to Senegal. It's a francophone country, as we mentioned earlier. English really is the lingua franca of the art world. You know, we've seen a lot of development in countries such as I just mentioned, Koyo is also involved at Zeitz-Mocker in Cape Town, South Africa. There's also CCA, which was founded by Bisi Silva, who was a guest here at the Academy, a hero of mine in Lagos in Nigeria, to found something over 10 years ago in a lesser visited country is really quite radical. To then close the exhibition space down after only a few years, and it's not because it didn't work out, it was simply because it wasn't serving the purpose that it needed to serve, I think is proof that we can see some truly amazing work coming out of the Raw Material Company if they continue to demonstrate this, not only willingness, but ability to adapt to whatever the market, well, not the market, but the educational scene may need.
I'd like to turn this to Rosalyn. Dark Artsman has a lot of money, so they're not so decoupled. They're not in the market per se, but there's a different system. And we talked a bit about patronage earlier today. Would you like to talk about decolonization, if it pertains at all to the summit, and if so, how?
Can I be heard? Is this good enough? Okay. Actually, I'd like to begin a little bit when we talk about decolonization. During my first visit to Dhaka, I went to the Liberation Museum, there's a thing. And I was really excited to see an early copy of a book which is called Sultana's Dream. I used to work at a feminist publishing house in Delhi, and that's where I first read this book. It's an amazing book. It was written in 1905 by a Bangladeshi woman, Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain. And it was an imagining of feminist utopia. And she envisioned a place that was called Lady Land. And men were pretty much, they had no role to play in all this. It was a land which was really peaceful. There was no crime because all crime was attributed to men. And it was an amazing early act of speculative fiction. It was also an early imagining of feminist utopia within the South Asian context. It's really interesting because when I have traveled to various parts of the world, and it's often assumed, I often have to go as a writer and I'm expected to feed into a narrative of female oppression within India, and I'm supposed to often validate this narrative, and say, oh yeah, it's really terrible for us women in India, and I noticed this a couple of times in places like Australia. It's very difficult to often convey what a context is to people who really don't, for whom where you live and where you're located doesn't factor within their consciousness. It just is not a part of their reality. So actually, what does decolonization look like within these contexts, where our imaginations are actually quite fragmented? Through the Dark Art Summit and through things that were happening in India over the last 10 years or 12 years that I've been actively writing about the art scene, is that there has been a very extensive focus on receiving validation from the West. And to me, it's easy to talk about decolonization, then becomes a kind of buzzword. It really does become like something that has certain currency to either, manipulate situations, but who you're talking to and to whose gaze your artwork or your exhibition is addressed, I think is a really important question. And when one thinks about what it means to decolonize or to uncolonize, it is something that we have to think about as a process, and a process that shouldn't have an end because it is always ongoing. It's never something that can have, and say, oh, now the project is over, and now we have successfully decolonized. One of the dangers that I perceived with events like the Dhaka Art Summit was that it was catering in very large ways to this, to the Western institutional validation. I have attended panels where there were primarily white institutional heads who were discussing elements of art history and the canon, and it was very hard for me as a person of color, as a person who comes from certain marginalized identity, to kind of sit there and listen to white institutional heads who have no real sense of what our lived realities are, to talk about the museum, which is in itself a colonial construct. In a place like South Asia, the museum was something that was designed to exoticize or fetishize artifacts of, colonized people. So when museums have conferences about decolonizing, it feels extremely hypocritical because the museum itself is a colonialist construct that is continuing its project of colonization. And it is often that the onus of decolonizing or the onus of puncturing the narrative falls on bodies like mine, on bodies like hers. It's like we are invited to queer the space, but also for institutions to show that they are not hegemonic, or that they are not patriarchal, or that they're not white supremacists. So what are the conditions for these inclusions to happen? And how do institutions, whether they're located in South Asia or whether they're located in other parts of the world, how do they continue to other, and how do they continue to gatekeep? And I think patronage is an important element of this. The reason why in India many institutions look to the West is for funding. Many artists in India are applying to the West for residencies and grants because there's no system back home, there's zero governmental support. So everything is extra institutional, and most collectors and funders in India are people who are rich, who come from corporate backgrounds and who are obligated to give money or to be patrons of art because it comes under corporate social responsibility laws and they get tax relief. And these are people who then assume positions of power because they are seen as the ones who have the opportunities to, give out. And so you have very clear structures of power. And as long as structures of powers, these kind of structures of powers exist, perpetuate and continue to replicate themselves, I don't think we'll ever even get into beginning the work of decolonization. Yeah, in a nutshell.
What can we learn from both of these institutions? What to do, what not to do? Maybe we already answered that question, but I wonder if you want to take it further.
Yeah,
How can we look into the future? Part of the things we wanted to touch on is coming from this pause in history right now. A lot of the things we're talking about may be drastically changed next year, next month, the next time in Dhaka, within 2022, what could they become? And we can even dream a little bit and be optimistic, utopian, if we want to be.
Should I go?
How many visitors were at the Dakar Art Summit? It was over.
The last one, it was the figures that I got were 477,153.
I don't even know how many people that is. I don't know what that looks like. I was wondering, do we need this? Do we need to continue to extrapolate this maximalism in order to achieve what we need? I mean, the raw material company, when they're hosting their academies, as I said earlier, there's a faculty of maybe 5-6 people and then 11 fellows. I mean, obviously you could talk about the issues that come about with gatekeeping because it is such a wonderful opportunity and then only 22 people can take part every year. But in not becoming this massive public imposition, is it able to be more successful? Perhaps, I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't been to Dakar, I've only read your piece, and then obviously met Diana at the conference a few years ago, but it seems that there might be quite a few hoops to jump through to make sure that it kind of meets these Western expectations we have for spectacle. What do you think?
One of the things that I've been wrestling with two questions when it comes to, even for myself, when it comes to making art. The first question I ask myself is it necessary? Sometimes, is it really necessary to make a monumental sculpture that uses a lot of steel, for example? Who does this serve, really? It sounds like a really flippant question because art is supposed to be beyond these considerations, supposed to be unessential, but it is an important question because you are mining a resource at the end of the day when you're creating something. But the other question I think is also, what does it make possible? I like this question, this hypothesis. What does something that you do as a gesture or as an intervention, what does it make possible? With the Dhaka Art Summit, it directly made possible many things for many artists. There were many works that were specifically commissioned by the Dhaka Art Summit, and I worked with some artists, who were friends, who would not have been able to realize some of those artworks if they didn't have that institutional support. Having said that, many institutions also function under the guise of being non-commercial, but in fact, like Biennales as well, there is a lot of institutional support that goes into it, and then there is a currency to the artworks that are displayed in these settings. They suddenly have value, or the value increases, and I think by not talking about market, there's a kind of erasure that happens over there. There's an erasure of labor and many other things that go into making these things happen and possible. And I would never want to erase or even take away from all the accomplishments. I mean, even if the Dhaka Art Summit doesn't have another edition, it has accomplished a lot. It has its pitfalls, and in each edition it tries to respond to the previous year's criticisms, and I really appreciate that about it. In that sense, it's kind of receptive and it's listening. But I think the COVID reality or the post-COVID reality, I don't know if in South Asia we can even right now imagine a post-COVID reality. And you have to understand how world politics plays out, where this is not, an event like this right now is still inconceivable in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh certainly, Even my own research has been interrupted because I can't even have interviews with artists over Zoom when they're battling, very real, like someone close to them is hospitalized or battling COVID, So how do we even, what role does art play, in nurturing communities, in supporting livelihoods, in imagining futures? I think we have to ask very difficult questions, and I think more developed parts of the world, and it's developed in inverted commas, have the luxury of, being able to move forward. I don't know what it's going to look like in India, with the Kochi Biennale still scheduled to take place in December. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know how it's going to happen. Even under normal circumstances, it's a feat because things are never ready in time. So I don't know. It's hard to speculate. proliferate. And I think one has to really think about extra institutional forms of nurture and solidarity and support. You know, I think really about how art can maybe be more instrumental in building community rather than, you know, being subservient to market demands.
I want to come back to Rosalyn, but what you said about Dhaka Art Summit. I was visiting the Dhaka Art Summit in 2018 and also watching these panel discussions with the director of MoMA and so on. And my personal perception was that these Western guys were so boring.
Yeah, they were really exceptional.
For me, it was, I thought, I'm not going so far to listen to them. And they say what they always say, what you can read on their webpages. And following this, I can resist to ask you, you said, we are invited to queer the space. So and I'm always thinking about exactly that. And also with our book, we discussed it often. Yeah? We said, we are white, the money comes from the West. Can we ever not fall into the trap, inviting you to queer the space?
No, I think the queering of the space is extremely necessary because I think how the invitation occurs and how different forms of hospitality, are practiced in different parts of the world. I think these gestures are really important because these are ways in which we bridge gaps. These are ways in which we try to even plug into our own gaps in our own understandings of the world. And this is, for example, what feminism is constantly trying to do, right? In talking about intersectionality, in talking about greater allegiances, in making sure that you are always representing the interests of many different marginalized communities and not just subscribing to one notion of even what woman is, right? So it's about this constant expansion, and I think that it is essential. When I talked to Bonaventure, who was also part of this book last year, when I was conveying to him my experience of being in Südtirol and in Austria, and how, for me, very often I'm in spaces where I am the darkest person there. And I'm very conscious of it. Not always made to feel weird about it, but I am conscious of this fact, and it's a strange experience. And Bonaventure had told me something that I thought was really wonderful. He said sometimes, the most radical thing that people like you and I can do in spaces like this is to just be there. Because the moment we're there, we make it a little difficult for everyone else. We remind people that this space doesn't belong exclusively to them, And we were actually talking yesterday. I thought it was a thing in my imagination, in Europe, and because I now spend more time here and I live here now. Every time I see a person whose skin color is closer to mine, who's not white, we see each other. We pass each other on the street, or sometimes even go up to each other and say, good morning or something. There is an acknowledgement. There is this, you don't have to ask anything. We don't say anything more beyond that. You don't even have to have a friendship. But it's just this thing that I see you, and I think sometimes that's the premise of all art and writing. It's this desire to be seen, this desire for attention, and this desire to feel like my subjectivity matters, And I think when we talk about greater inclusivity in historically white spaces, it is about expanding this gaze, and it's about saying this subjectivity is not the only one, there are other subjectivities, and they could be even narratives of hate, they could be, but how do we allow ourselves to radically, listen and include and be in conversation with each other and see each other? I think that's important because I think these are building blocks, to not hesitate from making that gesture, but to actually embrace,
Can I just add one thing too? Even in this discussion, wow, 500,000 people at which astonishes Europeans, and you think it's this mob, descending on that exhibition. But you mentioned something earlier too. There's a different way of viewing art where it's touched.
Yeah, and you have to constantly remind people not to touch the artworks, and that's its own vibe.
In that region, art is meant to be touched.
If I think of the most beautiful art that I encounter, it's like a sari. I mean, like an ikat weave. It's tactile, And in my understanding of art, it could be a kind of ceramic bowl or a terracotta bowl. These are things that are in everyday use. They're not meant to be in a vitrine. This notion also of what is art, and this art as something that needs to be isolated, that there has to be this distance between this object and me. Even that I sometimes think is a very Western idea, or it's a colonial idea, because in India, art is something that you lived with. You made paper, paper was handmade, and terracotta objects were handmade, and handloom, we had this whole industry. There were all of these things that got ruptured during, the capitalist expansion and the project that was colonialism that disrupted these markets. So really also, what is that conception of art? I don't think we question that. We kind of blindly follow this Western narrative of don't touch the artwork.
Other questions? Klaus?
Yeah, there was something I found interesting in, on the one hand, the raw material company moving away from exhibiting and going into directly giving feedback, and on the other hand, you're talking about the fact that do we still need these massive steel sculptures? Is there like a correlation between a move away from object-based art and the movement to radicalization? So now you kind of relativize it when you were talking of other kinds of still physical material productions, like the sari, but I was wondering whether there was somehow you saw.
I think it's a question of what it is that you think you need in order to make art. And I approached with my feminist upbringing, or my feminist leanings, when I think of the history of like female art, it's usually art that comes from not having resources. There's an amazing book by a Bengali author, Amanshauser, like My Life, and it was a Bengali housewife, and this whole book is an autobiography, and in this autobiography she talks about how she teaches herself to read and therefore write this book, and it's really brilliant. It's not about it's about using what you have, and it's about writing with like either blood or sweat or tears, like whatever material is at your disposal. It's not or making the material. So I'm sometimes a little bit skeptical when artists are encouraged to write proposals in order to create the artwork, because then you're essentially saying that this artwork can only happen if I have the resources that I need in order to make it happen. Whereas actually if something is really urgent, then it happens, like you reuse things, you paper over, and I think that urgency is it's important to understand where that urgency comes from. Do you scratch on a table if you don't have pen and paper, if you're in prison, if you're, there are all these narratives of Inquisition museums where they discover paintings by prisoners that were made with like nail and blood, so really what is the impulse to make art and to document? It doesn't have to be about having colossal amounts of material or patenting a particular pigment so that no one can ever use it again. I think of these as very masculinist kind of narratives.
I would definitely agree with you there. And not only is it about the means of creating art, but I was just thinking as you were talking just now about the way we look at art, just going back to what you were saying about abandoning this production exhibition cycle this, very commercial model, do we need any more steel sculptures? As you said, incredibly masculine, usually very phallic, stone and metal abominations you see on every street corner in central London, all with incredibly problematic histories. And I do think that is a very colonial, very Western, very problematic element of art that we need to think about. And talking about queering spaces, entering into spaces, as a person, entering a space, a collection, as an artifact, we also need to think about effective proximity in terms of how a viewing of this artwork is going to be affected by the artworks it's surrounded by in the city that it's in, given the local context. I was talking earlier today about one of the more important artifacts stolen from Nigeria during the sack of Benin, I believe it was the name of the thing. Anyway, there's one in New York and there's one in London, and to view, it's in the British Museum as well, need I say more, to view an artifact of that caliber, of that beauty, of that importance in the British Museum, it would completely taint my viewing of it, because I'm automatically thinking about being inside this institution. I'm looking around at all the other artifacts that were stolen within the same centuries that this artifact was stolen. If I'm not looking at other stolen artifacts, I'm looking at art that was made during imperial times in Western countries, and that is, it's going to mar my viewing. I can't be impartial and look at an artwork like that. I'm thinking again about monuments. Cara Walker opened her installation at the Tate Modern in London, Fons Americanus, which for people who haven't seen it, is a huge, essentially a satire of the Victoria Memorial, which is in front of Buckingham Palace. And she created a huge, I think it's plaster of Paris fountain, which essentially retells the story of the relationship between the West African people and the Atlantic through this very ornate sculpture. And at the top of the sculpture, where there would be, Britannia, this female heroine, instead you have the image of a black woman, and there's water bursting forth from her nipples, and then you look closer and you see that she's got a gash in her neck. So it's very much about the blood and the milk of the black woman nurturing the modern Western world. And it's a very complicated artwork, and I wanted to love it, and I very much did when I first saw it. But it's in the Tate Modern. It can't, unfortunately, it cannot detract from the fact of its location. And the Tate group was founded by Henry Tate, who at the time was the proprietor of Tate and Lyle Sugar, which was England's biggest producer of cane sugar, and they were operating in Indonesia and the former West Indies. And all of the money comes from exactly what Cara was trying to then comment upon, and it just felt quite, it felt like a very bad joke, because I know this history. I've done the reading myself. People passing through this institution, they haven't necessarily done that, and then all of a sudden it's not as successful as it could be. We were speaking about this at lunch. Okay, so what do we do now if we can't look at the art in the institutions? If they're not going to give it back, is the institution completely obsolete? Perhaps we need to rethink how we're displaying these artworks, because we're not going to make much progress by, doing these huge, expensive, very glamorous commissions if the institution itself isn't willing to even do something as simple as, put out a statement, or next to the exhibition text, go into a little bit about the history of the institution itself. It's not enough for these institutions to commission artworks like this and think that it's going to absolve them of their colonial history. It's also not enough for them to absorb artworks which could be, considered decolonial, post-colonial, if they are going to be in proximity to artworks which directly offend them and the viewing of them. We also have to think about how we are viewing these artworks. I was standing in front of Cara's fountain and people were taking photos of me with it as if my reaction to it was part of the installation. Then we were talking about it again at lunch. Do we have, segregated viewing hours? Of course not. That's completely backwards. So then we need to think about more practical and utopian ways of commissioning art, engaging with art in a way that isn't directly inherently contradictory.
I don't know what to say to that. That was fabulous. Should we open? Okay. We'd like to open up the floor to bigger general questions that Kate and Sanjukta could also answer, perhaps also us. we have a little bit of time. We can zoom out for a second. We actually don't have time. We're over time. Thank you for. But we can still ask questions.
Yes.
If someone has one. Everyone's hot and tired.
I have to say, it was really funny how many people, apparently Diana said, many people often confuse the Dhaka Art Summit and the Dakar.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of interesting and funny.
It's true.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the first machine science book.
What are you doing, Diana?
Yes. And he says, do you also receive letters for me? And I'm getting letters of you, which are intended for you. I hope it, but, you know, the raw material company was also present in Dhaka this time at the Art Summit. And I think the composition of the Dhaka Art Summit has been changing, and there is decolonization there has definitely become a buzzword. But they are trying to partner then with people who are either thinking about it academically, but also maybe are they also trying to develop an alternate topography of counter-institutional, extra-institutional spaces, because there were groups from Southeast Asia, in a sense, and we didn't get much time to go there because of. But do you get a sense that there is an ambition then from the Dhaka Art Summit, or maybe even Kochi, to then develop a different topography of patronage? Maybe problematic patronage, but patronage nonetheless that comes from the South.
Yeah, actually I really think that the patronage is the biggest, for me it's the biggest issue, and I think as an art writer I will continue to be extremely critical about the systems of patronage, whether it's the Dhaka Art Summit or whether it's the Kochi Biennale. I think the Kochi Biennale is an extremely, it's supposed to be the people's, biennale, but there's frequently issues of laborers not being paid. There was, I don't know if you follow the last Biennale, but it coincided with the Me Too movement, and one of the co-founders of the Kochi Biennale was accused of sexual harassment, and I don't think that the Biennale handled it very well at all. The Biennale was extremely hostile to even having a conversation about sexual harassment, and this was really funny because they were having, there was, the Gorilla Girls were invited to give a lecture presentation, and it was a conversation about feminism and space, but they were not receptive to having a dialogue about whether there was going to be a committee. We had, many of us had many questions, and just that day another artist who makes monumental steel sculptures had been accused of sexual harassment. So there was a lot that was happening, and I don't think many of the institutions handle many of these things really well. So it's also about who are the people that these institutions then directly harm, in their effort to be, what does it mean to have an exhibition about women's rights, but to not actually rally for the protection of women's bodies, or the bodies of the people who are working under you, for them to not have any rights. What does this mean? Really is the exhibition and dissemination of display of artworks, does that really take more precedence over the personal rights of a human being, no matter what that human being is or what sexual orientation or skin color, really is that object, or is that the Biennale more important than a single person's right to justice? For many of us in India, these questions became extremely important, and we saw some of the institutions that we really looked up to, we saw them behave in ways that were really unethical, morally questionable, and it was a very disillusioning experience. And a lot of us realized, many of us left the art world, exited in many ways. Many continue, but extra-institutionally, or are actively now engaged in making, queering these spaces and really doing, work that's more confrontational and provocative. It was a kind of reckoning moment for a lot of us. For the rest of the world, it's like Olamiju came and went, but for many of us, it was actively scarring. Some of us did an intervention at the Guerrilla Girls talk. We informed them that we were going to do it, and they appreciated the gesture. But some of the people who were part of that, I know for sure that art festivals in India didn't hire people who raised their voices, who stood out. This doesn't bode well for art institutions. And so if art institutions are not actually able to wrestle with the everyday questions of human rights, then really what is the point of what you're doing? And I think this is a very important question that I continue to want to ask. I can't not ask this question. Long-winded answer.
I think we stop here now. I appreciated a lot that you came all here, and the very special audience. I'm also happy you are here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. For me, there are 3 new encounters of our authors tonight. A special event in special times. Thank you all.